William Desmond Taylor's murder was a watershed in the history of Hollywood, occurring in the wake of the Fatty Arbuckle scandal, which was still dragging on after two mistrials. Taylor's mysterious death and the salacious details that emerged in its wake intensified the calls to rein in the debauchery that many believed lay beneath the glitter of Hollywood. The director of Huckleberry Finn and Anne of Green Gables was found dead in his apartment by his houseman, who reacted to the discovery by running screaming out the door. This drew a lot of people into the house, and even before the police arrived, the telephone lines were hot with the news that Taylor was dead. The investigation was botched from the very beginning as the police allowed Taylor's employers to remove items from his home, and the press interviewed anyone who would talk and printed whatever they said as fact. The result was a long list of suspects, most of whom were well known in Hollywood circles and were also unlikely to have committed the murder. The intervening years have done little to clear any of that up. Multiple books have been written on this case, and in most of them, the author has selected the killer of his choice and then selectively presented the evidence that supports that choice while ignoring anything to the contrary. In part one, I tried to outline the better known, or at least the more likely suspects, without cluttering the stage with the more far-fetched possibilities. In part two, we will discuss the day of the murder and why each of those suspects may or may not have committed the crime. If you find this content interesting, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. If you have a suspect that you favor, let me know in the comments. With that out of the way, let's get started with William Desmond Taylor's last day. February 1st, 1922 was a typical day for William Desmond Taylor. He rose early, bathed, and had breakfast. He was between films and had a little free time, so he planned to run some errands. Taylor and his chauffeur, Harry Fellows, took his now repaired McFarlane downtown and stopped at his bank to deposit two of his paychecks, which totaled about $900, and some stock dividend checks that totaled about $750. He then stopped at a nearby jewelry store and purchased a silver hip flask and a watch crystal. From there, he went to a department store and bought a copy of Rosamunde by Ethel Dell. At some point that morning, Taylor passed a car carrying Mary Miles Minter and her grandmother, Julia Miles. This was the first time Taylor had seen Mary since the altercation just before Christmas, and the two cars pulled over to the curb. Taylor had a brief discussion with Mary, and they exchanged a hug before parting, which could explain the blonde hairs that were later found on Taylor's jacket. Taylor then had lunch with Frank Garbett, who had been his cinematographer on Huckleberry Finn. By the time they were done, it was nearly 2 p.m., and Taylor had an appointment with Marjorie Berger, his accountant, to discuss his taxes. He spent 2 hours in her office and departed at about 4 p.m. His next stop was the Lasky studio, where he met with Barrett Keisling, the publicity director. They discussed Taylor's next film, The Ordeal, which was scheduled to start shooting the following Monday. From Lasky, he went to C.C. Parker's bookshop and bought a 2-volume anthology, The Home of the Verse. Taylor had given Mabel Normand a set of the anthology as a gift. However, she had lost one of the volumes, and he wished to replace it for her. He had his chauffeur drop him off at home and then deliver the volume to Mabel. Taylor went into his house and called Mabel Normand's home to tell her that the chauffeur was on his way with the book, but she was out. He then left his house and walked to the Payne Dancing Academy, where he took a lesson from his regular instructor, Mrs. Waybright. Seems that Taylor felt a need to work on his tango. Following his lesson, Taylor returned home and began working on his taxes. Sometime before 6 p.m., he called Marjorie Berger with some questions. She had to look up the answers and called him back a few minutes later. Peavy had dinner ready by 6:30, and Taylor finished eating shortly before 7. He then returned a call to actor Antonio Moreno. Moreno was in the middle of a contract dispute with Vitagraph, and Taylor agreed to assist him. They were to meet at the Lasky studio at 10 a.m. the next day. Taylor was still on the phone with Moreno when Mabel Normand arrived at about 7:05. Taylor made drinks, orange blossoms, which was Cointreau vodka, orange juice, and sugar. Peavy had finished cleaning up and left for the evening, stopping to chat with Mabel's driver, who was waiting with her car by the curb. Mabel smoked Chesterfield cigarettes, and they discussed a book that Taylor had lent her earlier. Taylor had an upright piano and had recently purchased a Victrola, which Mabel noticed and commented that Taylor was getting all too rich. They chatted for a while, and Mabel got up to leave at about 7:45. Taylor walked her through the court to her car, where her chauffeur was waiting, and they talked for a few minutes more before she got in. As the car pulled away, Mabel blew a kiss to Taylor by pressing her lips to the window and leaving a lipstick stain. Then Taylor walked back to his home and closed the door. This marks the end of what we know. One of the biggest problems with investigating this case is that it took place in Los Angeles, home of the motion picture industry. Today, even the accountants have headshots in this place, and it wasn't all that different back in 1922, the peak of the silent era. This story involves a lot of personalities, and as with so many Hollywood crimes, everybody wanted to make the story about themselves. Some would seek out reporters and pass on rumors, speculation, or even wholly made-up tales that were taken and reported on as fact. You add to that the yellow journalism of the day, in which reporters would go to extreme and sometimes illegal lengths to get a good story, and sensationalism ruled the press. The motto seemed to be, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. Things random people said were often reported without any vetting at all, so the truth got covered up with nonsense until it was nearly impossible to find. This case is an extreme example. On top of that, just keeping track of who is a challenge because almost everyone in this story changed their name at least once. To try to bring some order from this chaos, we'll take a look at each of the suspects' motive for committing the murder and what implicates or excludes them. Mary Miles Minter is a favorite suspect because she is the most salacious as the pretty young girl supposedly having an affair with a much older man. On the morning Taylor was found, Mary Miles Minter had slept late. She had just wrapped her latest film, Tilly, with a scene that required her to be repeatedly thrown into the Pacific Ocean surf at a Los Angeles beach and felt like she was coming down with a cold. She awoke just before 11 a.m. and was getting dressed when there was a knock at her bedroom door. It was her mother, Charlotte, asking to be let in. Mary replied that she was not dressed yet, but Charlotte insisted, so Mary opened the door and let her in. Once in the room, Charlotte announced, "William Desmond Taylor is dead." Mary became upset and asked how her mother knew such a thing, to which Charlotte replied that Carl Stockdale had called her and told her that the news was all over the lot at First National Studios. Mary hurriedly dressed and, against her mother's protest, ran to her car and sped to Taylor's house. Here we have a matter in dispute. Some accounts claim that Mary's grandmother, Julia Miles, accompanied her when she left the house, while others claim that Mary was alone. I believe that Mary was alone because no one who encountered her that morning made any mention of Julia being present. Those who think Mary was the killer believe it went something like this. Mary, wishing desperately for Taylor to marry her and take her away from her domineering mother, goes to Taylor's house to beg him one last time. She carries with her the gun that her mother had bought several years ago for protection, planning to kill herself in front of Taylor if she was refused. Seeing that Taylor is not alone, she creeps around the side of the house and waits for Mabel to leave. When Taylor and Mabel walk to the curb, Mary sneaks into the house to wait. A few minutes later, Taylor returns and Mary confronts him. He refuses her, and becoming more distraught, she produces the gun, threatening to kill herself. Taylor, smooth as always, calms her down. They share an embrace, and 3 of Mary's blonde hairs end up on the lapel of Taylor's jacket. But Mary is still holding the gun. As they embrace, the gun somehow goes off, and the bullet strikes Taylor. Taylor falls to the floor, gravely injured. Does Mary cry out? No. Does Mary try to help him in any way? No. Instead, in the space of a few seconds, Mary lays the body out, places the chair over his feet, and calmly exits the front door. She is seen by Faith McLean, whom she makes eye contact with. Cooley pretends to say goodbye to the man she pleaded with to marry her only a few minutes before and is now lying dead or dying on the floor. then just walks away. Oh, and she's dressed in men's clothing. The evidence that supports this theory, Mary was obsessively infatuated with Taylor, which was well documented by witness statements and her own writings. Her mother owned a .38 caliber revolver, and a few months earlier, following an argument with her mother, Mary had gotten the gun, locked herself in her room, and possibly attempted suicide with it. She fired the gun, but not at herself. The bullet lodged in the molding of the closet door in her room. Their chauffeur, Chauncey Eaton, broke through the door and rushed in with Charlotte to find Mary lying on the floor. Charlotte screamed, and Mary jumped up laughing as if the whole thing was some kind of joke. Charlotte took the gun and gave it to Eaton, who emptied the remaining bullets from it and hid the gun and ammunition on top of a furnace duct in the basement where the diminutive Mary could not reach them. After the murder, when police searched the house looking for the gun, they found the ammunition atop the duct. It was the same type of ammunition used to kill Taylor, but the gun was gone. Charlotte later claimed that she gave the gun to her mother, who got rid of it in a Louisiana bayou during a visit home. We do not know the model of the gun that Charlotte owned, but it was most likely a Smith & Wesson safety hammerless or an Iver Johnson hammerless safety. Both were chambered in .38 Smith & Wesson and were relatively small. Other models chambered in the proper round were too large and bulky to be the kind of gun a typical woman of the day would buy. Now, about those 3 blonde hairs. The hairs were not found on the jacket during the autopsy because Ivy Overholtzer had undressed the body before the coroner had arrived to do the post-mortem. It was only several days later, when detectives were examining the bullet hole in Taylor's jacket, that the hairs were discovered. The detectives compared the hairs to examples from Mary's hairbrush and found that the two were consistent with each other. The biggest problem with Mary as the killer is the path of the fatal bullet. If Mary were holding the gun while hugging Taylor, it would be very hard for her to point it in the proper direction to explain the bullet's path. She would have had to bend her wrist inward at an extreme and odd angle. Both potential revolver models had the hammer concealed within their frames, meaning that the trigger had to be pulled to cock the hammer. That made the trigger very stiff. With the shooter's wrist bent at that extreme angle, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to pull the trigger. Upon her initial police interview, Faith McLean said that the person she saw was a man, or at least was dressed as a man. Mary was quite petite at 5'1" and about 110 pounds. It was unlikely she could have passed as a man. The killer was far too calm and collected as he left Taylor's home to be a 19-year-old girl who just killed the man she loved. And to dress up as a man to go to Taylor's house and get him to marry her indicates some serious premeditation. Mary gave no signs of being that diabolical. Since we are talking about Mary, this is a good spot to discuss Charlotte Shelby. For people who know about this case, Charlotte Shelby is usually their favorite suspect. She was a remarkably dislikable woman, mainly due to her ferocity in protecting and at the same time controlling her youngest daughter. That said, I also think that at least part of the reason so many people disliked her was that she was an aggressive woman who took charge of a situation and got what she wanted. But that does not excuse what she did to both of her daughters in the pursuit of the wealth that they brought. Charlotte's motive would be to end Taylor and Mary's relationship, which would allow Charlotte to keep Mary and the money she earned under her control. The evidence of Charlotte being the potential killer is that Charlotte owned a gun of the type that was used to kill Taylor, and that gun could not be found after the murder. Charlotte was known to threaten people who interfered with or even appeared to threaten her control of Mary. When Charlotte found out that James Kirkwood and Mary were still writing to each other, Charlotte traveled to New York with the gun and threatened Kirkwood with it to recover the letters that Mary had written to him. Charlotte locked the correspondence between Mary and Kirkwood in a safe deposit box and used it to effectively blackmail Mary. That said, there are compelling reasons that Charlotte was not the killer. She had an alibi. At the time the murder was being committed, Charlotte was having dinner with Carl Stockdale, her mother, and Margaret. Stockdale, her cook, and the chauffeur, Chauncey Eaton, stated that Charlotte was home all night. Rumors abounded that Charlotte paid off everyone questioned to lie for her, but for that to work, she would have had to pay off her cook, her houseman, the chauffeur, and Carl Stockdale. It stretches disbelief that all these people would take the secret to their graves, even if she had paid them off. Finally, Charlotte as the killer does not explain the person that Faith McLean saw after she heard the shot. Charlotte's motive was supposedly that Taylor was about to wed Mary and take control of her and her money. That doesn't hold water against the statements that Taylor made to several people regarding the nuisance that Mary had become. Anyway, in comparison to what happened in American film with James Kirkwood, Mary's infatuation with Taylor was a minor event, and if anyone was going to get a bullet in the back from Charlotte, it would have been James Kirkwood, not William Desmond Taylor. While Charlotte was briefly considered a suspect and her house was searched, other than the bullets found in her basement, there was no supporting evidence or eyewitnesses to tie her to the crime. Eventually, interest in the case died down and it fell from the headlines, but would occasionally flare up again. The first time was in 1926 when Asa Keys, the newly installed LA County prosecutor, traveled to New York and Chicago to investigate Taylor's murder. The press, especially the Hearst papers, leapt on the story, and breathless bulletins were published on a near daily basis. This prompted the Los Angeles papers to re-interview almost everyone associated with the case, including Charlotte, Mary, and Mabel. The results of this investigation were presented to the grand jury, but no indictments were made. With the persecution of Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle still embedded in her mind, Charlotte decided to flee the country. She departed for Europe to be followed by Mary, where they remained for nearly 3 years. In 1937, during a lawsuit between Charlotte's older daughter, Margaret, and Charlotte regarding money that was kept in a shared safe deposit box, Margaret claimed in a deposition that she had protected her mother in the William Desmond Taylor case. This set off another media frenzy. In that deposition, Margaret stated that on the night of the murder, Charlotte was not at home and had expressed concern that she thought Mary was going to run away with Taylor. She also seemed to implicate her sister Mary, stating that she had left early in the evening and returned later that night crying. That suggests that Mary already knew that Taylor was dead before the body was found the next morning. Then, in the next sentence, Margaret states that Mary had told her that she thought her mother had killed Taylor. That doesn't make sense. Either Mary arrived at Taylor's house to find him dead after her mother showed up and killed him, or she was present when Charlotte killed him. If the former is true, then Mary got to Taylor's house, found him on the floor, and then left without calling anyone or doing anything to help him. If the latter is the truth, then Mary wouldn't think her mother killed Taylor. She would know. Margaret further testified that in August 1922, Charlotte's mother, Julia Miles, took Charlotte's gun to Louisiana and threw it in a bayou. That Julia Miles disposed of the gun is not widely disputed, but the question is, when did she get rid of it? If Charlotte was still in possession of the gun when her house was searched a few days after the murder, where was it? And if Charlotte was trying to hide it to avoid being implicated in Taylor's killing, why did she leave the ammunition on top of the duck to be found by the police? Why did she wait over 6 months to finally dispose of the gun? None of it makes sense. Finally, Margaret revealed the existence of the letters between Mary and James Kirkwood. To keep their correspondence secret, Mary arranged for Kirkwood to send the letters to someone at the studio who would pass them on to her. One of the stagehands found out and told Charlotte, who promptly searched Mary's room and found them. She then went to New York and retrieved the letters that Mary had written to Kirkwood. Mary's diary, which detailed her love for Taylor, was also in the safe deposit box. Margaret claimed that the diary was very explicit. One writer later embellished all of this, claiming that Mary was upstairs at Taylor's home when Mabel was visiting and came downstairs to find Charlotte in the house with the gun. All of it is the worst kind of speculation. This set off yet another media frenzy, which resulted in the case being brought before the grand jury again. Margaret, Mary, and Charlotte were called to testify, and the diaries were presented as evidence. They turned out to be nothing more than the girlish scribblings of an infatuated teenager. Again, in the end, no indictment was handed down and the whole thing was dropped. Despite the favorable result, the press was brutal and the Hollywood gossip columnists were even worse. There were likely layers of reasons for Margaret's testimony. Margaret wanted to be an actress from the time she was a small girl. Her mother took her to auditions and she got a few small parts, but wasn't really very successful. One afternoon, Margaret was scheduled for an audition for a play directed by Charles Frohman. Charlotte was unable to find a babysitter for 5-year-old Mary, so she was brought along. When Frohman came into the room to look over the children trying out for the part, Mary shouted out that he had a big nose, and Frohman was so taken with her that he chose her for the part immediately. Thus began Mary's stage career, and Margaret was pushed aside. She was reduced to being Mary's babysitter and playmate as the family toured the country. Mary appeared in her first film, The Nurse, in 1912 and then returned to the stage. But Charlotte realized that there was money to be made in the film industry without the constant travel of a touring theater company. In 1915, Mary was signed to a contract with Metro Pictures before moving on to American Film a year later. When Mary came to Famous Players Lasky in 1919, the family settled in Los Angeles. Margaret occasionally played local theater in LA and had bit parts in a few of Mary's movies, but that was about the extent of her acting career. Now, look at this photo. It pretty well sums up Margaret's position in the family and in Hollywood society. This is the version of it most commonly found online and reproduced in various books, and I have seen it captioned the formidable Shelby women. But this is not the actual photo. This is. Margaret is usually cropped out of it, just as she was cropped out of the fame that Mary achieved. Margaret surely harbored some level of resentment against her sister and her mother. Margaret embarked on some real estate ventures funded by Charlotte using Mary's earnings and did all right, but these soon petered out and she was left living on her mother's charity, supported by the earnings of her sister who had supplanted her. In 1925, Margaret married Hugh Fillmore, grandson of President Millard Fillmore. The marriage was rocky and they divorced in 1927. By the early 1930s, Margaret was suffering from depression, became a heavy drinker, and descended into alcoholism, which led to Charlotte committing her daughter to a sanitarium in 1936. Between her rehab stint and the lawsuit that resulted in the deposition, Margaret got married again, this time to a sometime film director named Emmett Flynn. They eloped to Yuma, Arizona, and hired a taxi to take them there. Once in Yuma, they shortchanged the driver, who went to the police, and the happy couple found themselves spending their wedding night in separate jail cells. They made bail and returned to LA, where Emmett ended up in another jail cell. Turned out that Emmett was already married and was on probation for desertion and non-support of the first Mrs. Flynn. Of course, the entire affair was plastered all over the newspapers. I can only imagine what the conversation was like between Charlotte and Margaret once she returned from Yuma. Then came the money missing from the safe deposit box that precipitated the lawsuit, and it is not too big a leap to imagine that Margaret saw the deposition as an opportunity to throw her mother under the bus. Margaret had an axe or two to grind. One thing that struck me about Charlotte and her two daughters is how this whole mess played out for them. To close the story, I'm going to digress a little. While Mary and Charlotte remained under a cloud of suspicion for the rest of their lives, they were never indicted. And after the 1937 grand jury investigation ended, that was the end of any legal threats for them. But they were very litigious, and every few years they seemed to be suing each other and other people over one thing or another. Margaret died in 1939 of what was termed a long illness. It was a combination of cirrhosis and other effects of long-term alcohol abuse. She was buried at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Los Angeles. Charlotte and Mary eventually reconciled and lived together until Charlotte died in 1957. Mary's contract with famous players Lasky ended in 1923 with her last film, The Trail of the Lonesome Pine, and it was not renewed. She never developed into the Pickford-level star that Adolph Zukor had hoped for, and while most of her films did all right at the box office, her salary made it difficult for them to be profitable. She received offers from other studios, but turned them down, stating she was never happy as an actress. Charlotte died at the age of 79 in 1957 and was buried next to Margaret in a locked private section of Forest Lawn Cemetery, but she did not remain there for very long. Mary wed Los Angeles real estate developer Brandon Hiltebrandt shortly after her mother's death, and following the wedding, Mary had both Charlotte and Margaret exhumed, cremated, and their ashes scattered into the sea from the Santa Monica Pier. Her husband died in 1965, but Mary continued to live comfortably in her Santa Monica home, thanks to Charlotte's and later her and her husband's shrewd property moves. Mary died in 1984 at the age of 82. In her final directive, she ordered that her body also be cremated and the ashes scattered from the Santa Monica Pier. It was almost as if she was trying to erase her family from existence. Now we come to Margaret Gibson. This one is pretty simple. She confessed. It was a deathbed confession. She must have done it, right? Not really. People confess to things that they didn't do all the time. That's why in a court of law, a confession by itself is not enough for a conviction. There has to be corroborating evidence, and in the immediate aftermath of Taylor's killing, 7 people confessed to the crime. Investigators discredited them all. Margaret Gibson and Taylor worked together briefly when Taylor first came to Hollywood, and at that time, she was a much more prominent performer than he was. After the 4 films that they both appeared in, they never worked together again. They were never linked in the papers in any personal way, and there is no evidence that they ever laid eyes on each other after Taylor left Vitagraph in 1914. Those who support Margaret as the killer base their theories solely on the confession and the claim that she was in Los Angeles at the time of the murder. Except she may not have even been in LA when the murder happened. She was working on a film called Cold Feet, which was filming on location in Truckee, California, the day Taylor was killed. Only a couple of Margaret's scenes were shot outdoors, and she may not have gone with the company to Truckee, but we have this photograph of the cast on location, and the woman who is seated appears to be Margaret. I'm confident that the seated woman is Margaret Gibson because this is a cast photo and there were only 2 women in the cast. Beyond the confession, everything else linking Margaret to the killing is supposition. We find this over and over in this case. Someone picks a suspect, then develops a scenario out of thin air to explain how they may have done it, and that gets taken up as a credible possibility. In this situation, the idea is that Margaret was involved in a blackmail scheme threatening to out several Hollywood men over their personal proclivities, and for some reason she had to kill Taylor. That's about all they have. So finally, we get to Edward Sands. When Taylor first hired Sands, he was the most fawning employee ever. At one point, he even wrote a bizarre letter to Taylor expressing his loyalty and stating that he would be Taylor's slave if that's what Taylor wanted. That letter should have been a warning sign that Sands was not the most stable canoe on the lake. Sands quickly revealed his true colors as soon as Taylor was out of earshot. The supposedly loyal valet reverted to his thieving ways and had to flee the scene, but he couldn't resist taunting his former employer. Taylor was convinced that Sands was behind the burglaries and the harassing phone calls. It fits because there were plenty of small, valuable, readily saleable items in Taylor's home, but what was taken in the burglaries were personal items, such as his cigarettes and cufflinks. The burglaries were not necessarily about money. They were about invading Taylor's personal space. Defecating in a person's bed is about as personal an invasion as you can get. Now, what evidence is there that the killer was Sands? First, the Jimmy V note. The person who wrote the note pawned the jewelry. The person who pawned the jewelry was the person who burglarized the apartment and stole the cigarettes. Cigarette butts found by the police near the house where the killer hid before entering matched the stolen cigarettes. A handwriting comparison determined that the person who wrote the Jimmy V note was likely Sands. Sands was a wanted man even before he came to Los Angeles. He had fraudulently enlisted in the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard multiple times. He had also deserted from both the Army and Navy and had committed crimes in both. If the warrants sworn out by Taylor were to be executed and Sands was caught, his true identity would be exposed. When the state of California finished with him, he would likely be turned over to the military, and when one branch finished with him, they would turn him over to the other. Keep in mind that Sands didn't just defraud the Army and the Navy. He did it in a way that was sure to piss them off, and Sands could have spent the next 2 decades bouncing from one prison to another. If Taylor were gone, maybe the warrant would go away and he might not be found out. Part of the reason for the extensive list of suspects is the endless speculation in the press over who might have done the crime. The police actively participated in this by planting stories in the paper, one of which not so subtly accused Mary Miles Minter of the killing. When the detectives planted the story, they knew it wasn't true, yet they did it anyway in the hope of flushing someone out. How that was supposed to work is a complete mystery to me. So let's return to the night of the murder. Shortly after 7 p.m., the McLean's maid, Christine Jewett, was doing the dishes when she noticed a man loitering in the alley behind the court smoking a cigarette. She didn't think much about it and wrapped up her chores for the night. The next morning, police found 2 gold-tipped cigarette butts in the alley. As Taylor and Mabel enjoyed their drinks and conversation, lurking in that alley behind Alvarado Court was the killer. Eventually, he moved to the side of the house where he could hide but be blocked from view by the shrubbery. He smoked a couple more cigarettes and dropped the butts on the ground. Hearing movement at the front of the house, he carefully peeked around the corner to see Mabel and Taylor exit the front door and head toward the street. Seizing his opportunity, the killer entered the house and hid in the kitchen or possibly upstairs. After seeing Mabel off, Taylor returned to the house and sat at his desk against the wall next to the entrance door. He began working on his taxes, carefully separating the checks he had written from those forged by his former valet. Taylor had only just begun to work when the killer emerged from his hiding place. Taylor heard something behind him and turned to see what it was. He was startled to see the gun pointed at him. Here, the manner in which Taylor was shot becomes the big problem in this case again. The path of the fatal bullet is by far the most confusing piece of evidence in this case. In 1970, writer Charles Higham interviewed Mary Miles Minter, and she recounted her conversation with Mabel Normand on the day Taylor was found dead. In that conversation, Mary asked the question that everyone who knows about this case has. How do you get shot like that? What were the relative positions of the killer and the victim? Was the shooter lying on the floor? Was he under the couch? I don't think either of those is the case. But the question is valid. How do you get shot like that? What I offer here is my theory of how it could have happened. The killer emerged from the shadows and Taylor turned to confront him. I imagine there was some exposition by the killer, this is Hollywood after all, followed by a brief struggle. This was not the classic Western knockdown drag-out. It was probably over in a few seconds. Much is made about the chair being out of place. Peavy mentioned it in his initial interrogation, and that it was not in its proper place against the wall was mentioned in nearly everything written on this case. The fact of the matter is, it was the desk chair. Taylor was sitting in it when the killer emerged. The rooms in Taylor's house were small, and in his sitting room, the chair was likely kept against the wall alongside the desk when not in use because it took up less space that way. Perhaps Taylor attempted to spring up from the chair to confront his attacker and fell over it. That would have put him in a position for the fatal bullet to take its path. Perhaps they grappled and the assailant dropped the gun, it hit the floor and discharged, the bullet striking Taylor. In those days, guns did not always have the safety features of modern firearms. The fact is, we simply don't know. At any rate, Taylor was struck and fell to the floor. While the bullet missed any vital organs, both lobes of his left lung were pierced and he was bleeding internally at a furious rate. The shock of the bullets passing through him had probably rendered Taylor unconscious, and the killer rolled him onto his back. This allowed the blood to collect in his chest cavity and further restrict his breathing. Taylor basically drowned in his own blood. The position of the right arm indicates a possibility that Taylor fell face down on the floor with his arm underneath him and the killer rolled him over, which would explain the extended arm, and the killer possibly rifled his body searching for something. The killer smoothed the lapels of Taylor's jacket and possibly adjusted his tie. The chair had gotten knocked over in the brief struggle, and the killer placed it near the wall, but over Taylor's feet. He then left the apartment through the front door, pushing the button on the latch to lock it. Douglas and Faith McLean had finished dinner, and Faith was in their sitting room knitting when she heard a loud pop. Faith hesitated for a few moments, wondering what the noise may have been. It seemed to have come from next door. She went to her front door and peered out into the darkness. A man stood on the corner of Taylor's front porch. He had his back to Faith, and she could not see his face. Then he slowly turned toward her. He seemed to smile for a second, then, acting as if Taylor had called to him from inside the apartment, he leaned into the door for a second before pulling it closed. The man then walked toward Faith before turning into the walkway between the houses that led to the alley in the back. Faith gave little thought to who the man might be. At 7:55, Howard Fellows, Taylor's chauffeur, called Taylor from the home of his girlfriend. Receiving no answer, he thought maybe Taylor was out and decided to take the McFarland back to Taylor's house for the night. Fellows arrived at Alvarado Court at approximately 8:15 and went to the front door to see if his employer needed anything else. All the lights in the house were on, so he assumed that Taylor was still up and about. Knocking, but receiving no answer, he tried to peer inside the apartment. Seeing nothing unusual, he knocked again. Still not getting a response, he thought maybe Taylor was upstairs or possibly at one of the neighbors. It was late and unlikely that Taylor would need him further that night, so he put the car in the garage and left. It was now nearly 8:20 p.m., and Taylor lay dying on his front room floor. In the immediate aftermath of the killing, police cast a dragnet searching for Sands, but he was never found. There were periodic rumors of his appearance in different places around the country, and at one point a dead body was identified as his, but it was later proven to be that of someone else. To say that this case has become convoluted is a huge understatement. There were multiple confessions, with Margaret Gibson's only being the best known, and a long list of additional suspects added by the Hollywood rumor mill. There were too many writers wanting to make money from the most sensational possibilities, the facts be damned. Add to that, the prosecutor in the case ended up in prison for corruption, and coupled with Charlotte's aggressive behavior and sometimes shady financial moves, it was a perfect storm. The result is, we will never know with certainty who killed William Desmond Taylor. In my humble opinion, the best suspect was Edward Sands. He had a motive and had engaged in escalating behavior with regard to Taylor, from burglary and taunting phone calls to creeping around the house while Taylor was home, and finally, perhaps murder. But then, everybody has their favorite suspect. So there you have it. This crime took place over 100 years ago, and we were no closer to a resolution than the investigators were that February morning. Interest in the case has not subsided, and even as I wrote this, online discussion groups were talking of another suspect who was one of Margaret Gibson's accomplices in an extortion scheme. So who do you think did it? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. This has been Crime Noir, Episode 2, Who Killed William Desmond Taylor? Be sure to tune in for Episode 3, where we will dig into a story of mass murder for insurance money. Next episode, Terror in the Skies, the twisted story of John Gilbert Graham.